The man in room 14 hadn't spoken in 11 days. Not to the attending physician who came by every morning with his clipboard and careful questions. Not to the social worker who sat across from him in the plastic chair and waited with practiced patience. Not to the chaplain who left a small Bible on the nightstand and never came back when it went untouched. 11 days of silence, and the staff at Hargrove Regional Medical Center had quietly given up, the way people do when they've tried everything and the wall doesn't move. His name was Daniel Osei, 44 years old, former Marine Raider, 3 deployments across 2 continents, a body that had absorbed more than most people could imagine, and a mind that had processed none of it. He'd been brought in after a neighbor called 911, not because he was violent, not because he was in immediate danger, but because he hadn't moved from his front porch in 2 days, hadn't eaten, hadn't responded when she knocked, just sat there in the November cold with his hands on his knees and his eyes fixed somewhere past the tree line. The paramedics found him hypothermic and mildly dehydrated. Medically, he was fine within 48 hours. Everything else was a different story. He refused to be admitted to the psychiatric ward, refused to sign forms, refused to participate in group sessions, refused meal trays, refused the television remote. What he did not refuse, what he held on to with both hands the moment they brought her in, was his dog. Her name was Sable, a black Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, trained as a psychiatric service animal through a veteran support program out of Fort Bragg. She wore a vest that said, "Do not pet" in red lettering, and she sat at Daniel Osei's feet like a soldier at post when the night terrors came, and they came, even in a hospital bed, even in a place full of fluorescent light and antiseptic. Sable would put her head on his chest and stay there until his breathing slowed. The problem was that Dr. Harrington wanted Sable removed. He had reasons. He always had reasons. Animals in a medical facility presented liability issues, he said. Allergen concerns for other patients. Hygiene protocols. He cited 3 different passages from the hospital's internal policy manual, and he said them the way people say things when they already know they're winning the argument. Nobody pushed back. Not really. The charge nurse on the day shift mentioned that service animals were federally protected under the ADA, and Dr. Tenema Harrington told her that Sable was being kept in a private room, and therefore the argument didn't apply in the way she thought it did. And that was the end of it. Except it wasn't, because Tessa Brandt hadn't heard about any of this yet. She came on at 7 in the evening, second week of November, pulling off her scarf in the elevator and checking her phone for the handoff notes. She was 31 years old and had been a registered nurse for 6 years, 4 of them in critical care and the last 2 in the behavioral health unit at Hargrove, which meant she had seen things that most people couldn't sit with, and she'd learned to sit with them anyway. She had short dark hair, a gap between her front teeth, and a way of entering a room that was quiet enough that patients sometimes didn't notice her until she was already there, which she had always considered a professional asset. She read the note about room 14 twice. Then she walked down the hall and stood in the doorway. Daniel Osei was sitting on the edge of the bed. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. Sable was pressed against his left leg, perfectly still, watching the door with eyes that were calm and assessing at the same time. The room smelled faintly of dog and antiseptic and something else. The particular staleness of a space where a person has been very quiet for a very long time. Tessa didn't say anything. She didn't introduce herself, didn't pull out a chart, didn't start the standard intake review that she was technically supposed to complete before the end of her first hour. She just stood there in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, and then she looked at Sable. "Malinois," she said. "Females are usually calmer. Good choice." She wasn't talking to Daniel Osei. She was talking to no one in particular or to herself, the way she sometimes narrated observations when she was thinking through something. It was a habit she'd picked up somewhere and never quite lost. But Daniel Osei's eyes moved, just slightly, a fraction of a degree toward her. The first lateral movement anyone had noted in 11 days, according to the chart. Tessa didn't react to it. She made a small note on her tablet and moved on to her other patients. She came back at 10:30 with a meal tray she hadn't been asked to bring. She set it on the table beside the bed without comment, moved his water pitcher 2 inches closer to his right hand because she'd noticed he was right-handed from the way he held Sable's leash, and started to leave. "She'll eat anything," Daniel Osei said. His voice was rough from disuse. Flat in the way voices get when someone has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Tessa stopped. She didn't turn around immediately, and she didn't make a sound of surprise. She just paused, like she was finishing a thought. "She eating your food?" Tessa asked. A long silence. Then, some of it. "What's she not eating?" Another pause. "The rice." Tessa nodded slowly. "Smart dog." She left the room. She could feel something shifting behind her, the way air pressure changes before weather comes in. She noted the exchange in his chart with clinical precision. First verbal communication, day 11, approximately 22:30 hours. And then she went back to work. The next 3 days were slow, not dramatic. Nothing about what happened in room 14 was dramatic in the way that people expect drama to look. No breakthroughs over a single conversation. No moment where Daniel Osei suddenly wept and everything came flooding out. Real healing doesn't work like that. Real healing is a man eating half a meal on day 12 and 3/4 on day 13. It's a dog moving from the floor to the edge of the bed. It's a question, asked very quietly, about whether the window could be opened a little. Tessa answered every question the same way she'd handled the first one, without performance, without manufactured warmth. Just straight. When he asked if he could take Sable outside, she said she'd look into it, and she actually did. And she came back with a concrete answer rather than the vague promises that drove people like him absolutely insane. When he didn't want to talk, she didn't push. When he did. And it started happening, slowly, in pieces. She listened the way people listen when they actually want to understand, and not when they're just waiting to respond. On day 15, he told her about Fallujah. Not all of it. Not even most of it. But enough that she understood what the nightmares were about, understood why certain sounds sent him rigid, and why the fluorescent lights had been dimmed in his room at her request since the second night. He'd been part of a unit that took casualties in a way that didn't make sense. A decision made from far above that had put his people in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he'd carried the weight of surviving it the way some veterans carry that weight, silently, privately, and at enormous cost. "You ever talk to anyone?" Tessa asked. Not a therapist question. An honest one. "Talked to a lot of people," he said. "Not many of them heard anything." "Hearing's different from listening," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. Like a man who had learned not to trust his first read of a person and was now revising his second. "You sound like you know that from both sides," he said. She didn't answer that directly. She made a note about his appetite and asked if Sable had had water recently and moved on. But he'd been right, and they both knew it. What Tessa knew, that Daniel Osei didn't yet, was that she had grown up with a father who had come back from Desert Storm different from how he had left. She knew what it looked like when a man learned to sit very still as a defense mechanism. She knew what it sounded like when someone's breathing changed at 3 in the morning. She had spent 18 years in that house watching her mother try to reach someone who had built walls in all the places that used to be doors. And she had become a nurse, partly, not entirely, but partly, because of what it felt like to stand outside those walls and have no idea what to do. She knew what to do now, and the most important thing she had learned was not to perform doing it. On day 17, Dr. Harrington came back about Sable. He brought it up in the morning rounds, framed it as a patient welfare concern. Osei needed to be engaging with the clinical team, he said, and the dog was functioning as an avoidance mechanism. Remove the crutch, he said, and the patient would be forced to engage with his treatment plan. Tessa was standing at the nurse's station when she heard him say this. She was charting, technically, but the behavioral health unit was not a large floor, and Dr. Harrington had a voice that carried. She set down her stylus. The charge nurse, a man named Gordy who had been at Hargrove for 20 years and had a talent for not being in the room when conflict was imminent, was already finding something to do near the supply closet. Tessa walked into the hallway. "Sable isn't an avoidance mechanism," she said. "She's a medically certified psychiatric service animal. She's been registered through the National Service Animal Registry, and her documentation has been in his chart since admission. She's performing a clinical function that nothing else in this unit has been able to perform in 17 days. Dr. Harrington looked at her the way doctors sometimes look at nurses when they want to remind them of the hierarchy without having to say it out loud. "Nurse Brandt," he said, "I appreciate your perspective. I want to note," she continued, her voice very even, "that Mr. Osei has shown measurable improvement every day that Sable has remained in that room. He's eating. He's communicating. He participated in a session with Dr. Varga yesterday for the first time since admission. Separating him from his service animal at this point would not accelerate treatment. It would reverse it. There are liability issues." "There are," she agreed. "There are also federal statutes. The ADA and the Fair Housing Act both protect the use of psychiatric service animals in medical settings. I can have the relevant sections on your desk in 20 minutes if that would be helpful." He looked at her for a moment. Around them, the hallway had gone very quiet in the specific way. Hallways go quiet when people are pretending to do other things. "This isn't your decision to make," he said. "You're right," she said. "It's your decision. I'm just making sure you're making it with complete information." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make the point, then turned and walked back to the nurse's station and picked up her stylus and kept charting. Sable stayed. Dr. Harrington's order to transfer Sable to the hospital's overnight animal holding, a place typically used for emotional support animals visiting other patients, was rescinded the following morning, before Tessa arrived for her shift. She didn't know for certain what had happened between those hours, but Dr. Varga, the staff psychiatrist who had finally gotten Daniel Osei to sit across from him for 90 minutes the day before, had submitted a formal clinical recommendation that morning. It cited the measurable therapeutic progress directly correlated to the service animal's presence. It cited federal law. It cited in very precise language the potential liability exposure the hospital would face if a veteran with documented PTSD experienced a clinical setback directly attributable to the removal of his certified service animal. The word liability had a way of moving paperwork very quickly. What Tessa didn't know, not yet, not for another week, was that Dr. Harrington's instruction to remove Sable had not been an isolated judgment call. One of the nursing aides had mentioned, quietly, that he had given similar orders about another patient's therapy dog 2 months prior, and that patient had been transferred to a different facility under circumstances that nobody had quite examined. Tessa filed a report with the hospital's patient advocacy office. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, carefully, with dates and times and the names of everyone present, without editorializing or exaggerating or softening. She handed it to the patient advocate on a Thursday afternoon and said, "I want this on record." The advocate, a woman named Sandra Plitt, who had worked in hospital administration for 11 years and had the particular look of someone who had seen enough to be permanently unsurprised, read the first page while Tessa stood there. "You know this might go nowhere," Sandra said. "Maybe," Tessa said, "but then it's on record that it went nowhere." Sandra looked at her for a moment, and then she looked back at the document and she said, "Okay." The investigation that followed was not fast and it was not clean. These things never are. There were meetings and counter-meetings in a brief but unpleasant period during which Dr. Meetings and a brief Harrington's administrator sent an email, not to Tessa directly, but to the unit manager, noting that Nurse Brandt had shown a pattern of undermining physician authority. The unit manager, a woman named Joyce Alderman, who had known Tessa since her first day at Hargrove and had trained her personally, read the email once and then set it aside and did not mention it to Tessa at all for 2 weeks, at which point she mentioned it only to say that she had submitted her own response. Joyce had written, in return, "Nurse Brandt has shown a consistent pattern of advocating for her patients' clinical well-being in accordance with both hospital policy and federal law. I am uncertain which of those behaviors is being characterized as problematic." In the end, the hospital's patient advocacy review found 2 documented instances in which Dr. Harrington had ordered the removal of certified service animals without clinical justification and without consulting the attending psychiatrist. The review board recommended mandatory retraining in ADA compliance and the establishment of a formal protocol for service animals in the behavioral health unit, a protocol that previously had not existed. It was not the outcome Tessa had hoped for, and it was not nothing. Those 2 things were both true, and she understood how to hold them at the same time. Daniel Osei was discharged on a Tuesday, 23 days after he had been brought in from his front porch in the November cold. He walked out through the main entrance with Sable at his left heel and a referral to a VA-affiliated outpatient PTSD program in his coat pocket. The referral was to a therapist who specialized in trauma-informed care and had a military background, which Tessa had specifically requested on his behalf, and specifically followed up on twice to make sure it came through. He stopped just outside the automatic doors. Tessa was at the end of her shift, and technically she had no reason to be near the entrance at that exact moment. She'd told herself she was going to the cafeteria. She wasn't going to the cafeteria, and she knew it. He turned around and looked at her for a moment. Sable sat down beside him, watching the parking lot with the calm, professional attention of a dog who understood her job. "You did something," he said. "I filed a report," she said. "About Harrington. About a pattern of behavior that was affecting patient care," she said carefully, "which is in the job description." He looked at her for a long time. The November light was flat and pale, and the parking lot was very quiet. "My dad was a nurse," he said finally. "Army medic, then a nurse. He always said the doctors decided what happened and the nurses decided what actually happened." He paused. "I didn't understand what that meant until I was in here." Tessa didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. He gave her a small nod, not exactly a salute, but something in the same register. A gesture that meant something between military people, and she recognized it for what it was. Then he turned and walked across the parking lot with Sable beside him. And Tessa stood there until he got to his car, and then she went to get her coffee, and she thought about her father, and she thought about walls with no doors, and she thought about the particular weight of a moment when a door finally opens, even just a little. She was back on the unit by 7 the next morning. Room 14 had a new patient. The bed had clean sheets, and the window was cracked open 2 inches, the way she always liked it, and Sable was gone, and the room smelled like nothing in particular, the way rooms do when they're ready to begin again. I keep thinking about the moment Tessa said Malinois to an empty room. She wasn't trying to reach him. That's the part that stays with me. She wasn't performing compassion or running through a checklist of therapeutic techniques. She just said what she noticed, out loud, the way she always did, and something in a man who had been silent for 11 days, a man who had learned through years of hard experience that most people were not worth responding to, moved. Just slightly. Just enough. That's how it actually works, I think. Not the grand gestures, not the speeches, the small, true thing said at the right moment by someone who meant it. What Tessa had was integrity. Not the word on a hospital mission statement, but the real version. The version that costs something. When Dr. Harrington made his case about liability and protocol, she didn't flinch and she didn't capitulate. She held her ground, not because she was angry or trying to win, but because she had looked at Daniel Osei in that room and she understood what was actually happening and she was not willing to pretend otherwise. That kind of moral clarity is not common. It is not comfortable. It made her unpopular with at least one powerful person in that building, and she knew it would, and she filed a report anyway. There's a line of cause and effect running through everything that happened in room 14. Daniel Osei was brought in from the cold because someone finally called 911. He stayed silent for 11 days because every previous interaction had confirmed his expectation that no one would actually see him. Tessa saw him. Not because she had a gift, but because she had done the work to understand what PTSD looks like from the inside. What it costs a person, what they need and don't need. That's not instinct. That's knowledge, hard-won and deliberately applied. She had watched her own father live inside those walls for 18 years. She had chosen to learn what he had never been given the language to explain, and when she walked into that room, she used what she knew. That combination, the willingness to do right and the actual understanding of how, is rarer than either one alone. I've seen people with good intentions cause real harm because they didn't understand enough. I've seen people with tremendous knowledge do nothing because it was easier. Tessa had both, and she had the third thing too, the endurance to keep showing up. Day 12, Day 13, Day 15. The slow progress that doesn't feel like progress when you're in the middle of it. The follow-up calls about the VA referral. The report filed on a Thursday afternoon when she could have told herself it wasn't her problem. Daniel Osei walked out of that hospital with a referral in his pocket and a name, a specific therapist, a specific program, because Tessa had made 2 follow-up calls to make sure it came through. That's not in any job description. That's just someone deciding that the work doesn't end at the edge of what's required. I think about Sable sitting at his feet, a dog who knew her job and did it without being asked, without recognition, without anyone explaining to her why it mattered. There's something in that I find clarifying. Showing up. Staying. Doing the thing you're there to do, even when the room is quiet and no one is watching, and it's hard to tell if any of it is working. It was working. It just took 11 days to see it.